Welcome to our discussion on considering monetary policy amid current turbulent economic conditions. On today's agenda, we'd like to review the Federal Reserve's dual mandate and whether it's currently being met, examine current macroeconomic conditions and outlook of the economy, evaluate the effectiveness of policies that the Fed is already implementing or could implement in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then finally prescribe a monetary policy recommendation. So firstly, let's take a look at the Federal Reserve's dual mandate of achieving maximum employment and maintaining stable prices.
When looking at the U3 unemployment rate, we see that we have recovered significantly from the initial spike in unemployment in March and April, caused by government lockdowns and stay-at-home orders. However, the recovery rate is subsiding, and we still have not returned to pre-pandemic levels of unemployment. Another detail to consider is that the U3 does not reveal the whole picture because it only includes people who are actively seeking employment. For example, it is likely that many workers have become discouraged after not being able to find jobs in current labor market conditions. In order to get a better view of unemployment, we instead turn to the U6 rate, which encompasses discouraged and underemployed workers, alongside with those considered unemployed. When comparing the two rates, we see that the U6 is still significantly higher than the U3, and that the spread between the two rates has increased due to the pandemic. Along with the increased number of discouraged and underemployed workers, there's also significant racial disparities in unemployment that seem to be exacerbated by the pandemic.
Now, let's look at the price stability side of the Fed's mandate. In recent years, we've seen a continued state of low inflation, often below the Fed's inflation target of 2%. As shown here by the core PCE, inflation has consistently stayed below 2% since the Great Recession. This was further exacerbated by the pandemic, which caused significant disinflation that led the rate to go below 1%. Since then, it appears that inflation has reinflated mildly, though still underperforming the Fed's 2% inflation target. Addressing the persistence of low inflation from both before the pandemic and now remains a key objective for developing proper monetary policy.
Next, let's take a look at current economic conditions through a multitude of macroeconomic variables and risks that may critically hamper future economic growth. We can start by examining the changes in real gross domestic product in the last year. Real GDP cratered during Q2 at the start of the pandemic before recovering and gradually increasing after Q3, although still not reaching its level before the pandemic. GDP is a broad and simple approach to analyzing the country's economic conditions. So let's further examine real GDP changes by considering the impact on each of its components.
Right. So firstly, let's look at consumption. So according to a survey of consumers conducted by the University of Michigan, consumer sentiment has plummeted since the beginning of the pandemic. While we see that consumers are more optimistic in current economic conditions relative to during the global financial crisis and Great Recession, it's also clear that consumer sentiment has not been recovering at a substantial rate. So this is likely due to the continual effects of the pandemic and the ongoing stringent government orders that have limited consumption. So we can also turn to look at how consumer spending has changed for different sectors. So durable goods, non-durable goods, and services have all declined since the onset of the pandemic. But durable goods, such as consumer electronics, home applications, and vehicles, have recovered dramatically since then. So this could be due to people spending more on home improvement and entertainment outlets at home as they're less free to go out. And meanwhile, consumption of non-durable goods, such as food and clothing, have been growing, though not to the extent of durable goods. So finally, consumption of services has continuously been declining as people are unable to travel, visit tourist destinations, go out to restaurants, and other activities restricted by pandemic measures and fears. Then total consumption spending has been gradually recovering since initially plunging by 30% at the start of the pandemic. By late January, it appears that total consumer spending has resumed to levels on par with January of 2020.
However, consumer spending has been split disproportionately among different industries. For example, spending on retail has surged to over 21.6% since last January, a likely result of growing popularity of electronic retailing as more people make purchases at home. Meanwhile, industries that require people having to go out have suffered significantly. Restaurants and hotels have taken a significant and gradually recovering decline as people eat out and travel less. Entertainment and recreation suffer even more as consumers fear or are restricted from going out to the movies, visiting amusement parks, and other out-of-home activities. Finally, there seems to be a disparity in which businesses have been benefiting from consumer spending amid the pandemic. Small businesses' revenue has declined and plateaued at negative 30.5% since January of 2020, whereas we saw earlier that there has been increases in consumer spending in goods in certain industries. This could likely be due to more consumer spending being funneled to big businesses like Amazon, who have the capabilities to quickly accommodate and cash in on new opportunities presented by the pandemic, like online shopping.
Let's also take a look at the investment component of real GDP. The Purchasing Managers Index helps show the prevailing direction of economic trends in the manufacturing and service sector. While the PMI plunged at the beginning of the pandemic, it has since surged above 50, a benchmark that represents an expansion in investments from the view of purchasing managers. Non-defense capital goods, excluding the volatile purchasing of aircraft, has also recovered and increased dramatically since the pandemic began. Finally, housing starts, indicating changes in housing investments, also shows a complete recovery and further growth beyond the levels of January of last year. All in all, these indicators show that the investment and manufacturing production have picked up and grown exceptionally as the pandemic progressed. We should also look at how the trade balance has been affected by the pandemic. Net exports of goods and services have been declining since the onset of the pandemic, further lowering the US's already negative trade balance. The US's importation of more goods than it exports is also shown by a very similar decline in the current account balance, which includes payments and transfers along with the trade balance.
Meanwhile, government spending to fund fiscal responses to COVID-19 has bolstered consumption and investment, all while targeting people and businesses most impacted by the pandemic, such as low-income workers and small businesses with difficulties in maintaining its workforce. As the pandemic continues to progress into the new year, we need to consider the significant risk to the economy that will inform us in formulating the most effective monetary policy. Firstly, while many different vaccines have been approved and implemented across the world to combat the pandemic, limited resources have created vaccine distribution uncertainty, with many marginalized communities and countries overlooked. Secondly, the recent rise of vaccine-resistant variants pose a looming risk on the future of economic conditions. Finally, with interest rates slashed to 0%, the Federal Reserve has arrived at, and perhaps beyond, the effective lower bound of monetary policy, which includes significant risks of its own. We'll further delve into the ELB when we evaluate potential monetary policies. Considering the many risks to future economic conditions, which appear to be both severe in uncertainty and potential impact, it's very difficult to lay out an accurate economic forecast. The Conference Board's most probable forecast base case shows U.S. economic output returning to pre-pandemic levels by July 2021, with a more optimistic upside forecast showing a return as soon as April. Meanwhile, the downside forecast offers a pessimistic scenario involving a third wave of vaccine-resistant mutations, ineffective distribution of vaccines, and limited fiscal stimulus. All things considered, we see that a multitude of pandemic risks have made future economic conditions difficult to predict.
With these economic conditions and risks in mind, let's move forward with evaluating the current monetary policies being implemented by the Fed and what other tools might be at their disposal. So, as we had mentioned before, the Fed has reached the effective lower bound in engaging in conventional monetary policy. So we see this ELB through a variety of Fed tools, the most important being the federal funds rate, which has been set to be between 0 and 0.25% since mid-March. And then alongside the primary tool of targeting the federal funds rate, the Fed has also slashed the discount rate to 0.25%, encouraging banks to take out loans through the Fed's discount window, and then hopefully lending the money to potential borrowers. And as of March 26th, the Fed has also eliminated reserve requirements for all depository institutions, bringing up required reserves to be used for further lending. So the interest rate on excess reserves was also lowered to 0.10% to disincentivize banks from holding reserves that could instead be lent out. And the measures that the Fed has taken in cutting the federal funds rate, discount rate, interest rate on excess reserves, and eliminating the reserve requirements have exhausted the central bank's conventional toolkit of expansionary monetary policy. So with the Fed hitting the ELB, non-conventional policies must be considered.
So one potential policy that could essentially bypass the ELB is simply crossing the zero bound and setting negative interest rates. This effectively causes depository institutions to have to pay to keep their excess reserves stored at the bank, which incentivizes them to spend and lend rather than hoard cash positions. Such a policy could greatly support the reversal of deflation or disinflation. A weakened dollar would make exports cheaper and improve the trade balance. That being said, however, a negative interest rate environment could potentially lead to consumer cash hoarding, financial instability, and incur the negative effects of a weakened dollar, which include more expensive imports and less domestic competitiveness. These effects have been shown in places where negative interest rates have been tried, including the Eurozone, Japan, and Scandinavia. Given the drastic downsides of negative interest rates and the uncertainty surrounding how such a policy would interact with the environment of the pandemic, we believe that it's best to leave negative interest rates out of consideration as we are faced with the ELB. Instead, we could look toward forwards guidance as a non-standard monetary policy. Throughout the pandemic, the Fed has already offered important forward guidance regarding the lowering and maintenance of interest rates. This policy of communication works to influence the financial decisions of households, businesses, investors, and depository institutions by providing a guidepost for the expected path of interest rates. In the Fed's December 2020 press release, the FOMC members agreed that the current low federal funds rate should be kept until inflation is on track to exceed 2% for some time. This new shift in the Fed's price targeting objective is a policy that seeks to address the long period of low inflation below 2% that has persisted before and during the pandemic. Engaging in flexible average inflation targeting means aiming for an inflation rate greater than 2% to average out this inflation to its target of 2% over time, ideally meeting the price stability part of the mandate.
Back to forward guidance, we recognize that it can be used differently with varying degrees of success and limitations. By using the policy as a commitment device to setting future interest rates lower, households can expect a higher inflation rate and rate of real output growth in the future, which increases current consumption. However, sticking to previous commitments of policy could contradict present policy actions. This time inconsistency problem weakens the public confidence in forward guidelines. Instead, we should look to use forward guidance as a projection of future policy in the absence of commitment. Focusing on targets, such as the ones set by FAIT, is more beneficial than focusing on specific future rates. Another unconventional policy discussed in the Fed's forward guidance was quantitative easing, which the Fed has been engaging in since March, as we can see from the recent increase in the Fed's balance sheet. Such sizable asset purchases are shown to be significantly helpful in offsetting the adverse effects of the ELB at low interest rates. Thus, current interest rates conditions of the ELB warrant the active use of QE as a secondary tool to short-term interest rates.
We also want to be careful with the tapering off of QE. The taper tantrum following announcements of exiting from QE after the global financial crisis caused a collective reactionary panic that triggered a spike in the US Treasury yields. In line with Chair Powell's comments at the latest FOMC press conference, we believe that focusing on such worries is too premature. Clear communication regarding a QE exit strategy will be necessary in the future when further progress has been made.
Yield curve control, or YCC, should also be considered as a policy alternative that targets longer-term interest rates by setting target caps on long-term bonds through purchasing them. While QE deals in quantities of bonds, YCC focuses on their prices. According to Eberly, Stock, and Wright, the aggressive usage of slope policies such as YCC could have substantially sped up the recovery in the labor market and support reflation. Implementing YCC when conventional monetary policy hits the ELB has shown to be especially important. Most recently, in 2016, the Bank of Japan introduced YCC in its fight against the yen's deflation. The bank has been successful at maintaining its yield caps while purchasing fewer bonds than their earlier QE program. The slower pace of purchases by the Bank of Japan shows that credible YCC policy can be more sustainable for the Fed than QE.
Alongside these considerations, the Fed has also established funding, credit, liquidity, and loan facilities. They have been critical to stabilizing and improving market functions and credit flow to households, businesses, and state and local governments amid the pandemic. These facilities have been shown to be successful in resolving financial stress and volatility, with indices of both showing a recovery back to pre-pandemic levels.
So considering the policies discussed and current economic conditions, we will now conclude by summarizing our policy recommendation. So we propose keeping the target federal funds rate at 0 to 0.25% and maintaining the current QE program at its ongoing pace. And furthermore, we recommend no changes to ongoing facilities and the non-committal language in forward guidance. Alongside our recommendation, we reject a negative interest rate policy amid the pandemic and affirm the flexible average inflation targeting approach to achieving price stability. And then we also look to develop a very open and communicative QE exit strategy in the future to prevent irrational market reactions. And finally, we are open to implementing YCC as an unconventional policy at the ELB. Thank you for your time.